Caleb Mercer worked every Christmas Eve, and the men on his ranch had learned not to argue with him about it. He was not a hard employer. He did not begrudge Levi Brennan the cards tucked into his coat, or Amos Redfern the extra molasses for the men's supper. Caleb checked the cattle before the light went gray, made sure the north trough was clear of ice, and told Levi to bank the bunkhouse stove well, because the wind had turned sharp. "Don't wait on me for supper," he said. Levi looked toward the big house. Wasn't planning to. Christmas would happen on Caleb Mercer's land. It simply would not happen in Caleb Mercer's house. The dining room had been closed since his mother died in the spring of 1887. The long table still stood beneath a plain cloth, with more chairs than one man needed. Ruth Mercer had once filled that room, without seeming to try. Ranch hands, neighboring wives, anyone who needed a plate. For 3 evenings after the funeral, Caleb ate there alone. On the 4th, he carried his plate into the kitchen. By summer, the parlor was rarely opened. By autumn, town invitations were answered with work or weather. Caleb still rose before daylight and ran his ranch well. The trouble came after the work was done. A second cup, a half-formed remark, an empty chair. So he learned a smaller route through his own house. Kitchen, office, bedroom. The first Christmas after Ruth's death, Amos asked whether to set the dining room. Caleb said no. The second year, Amos did not ask. That Christmas Eve, snow began before sundown. 5 miles away, Miriam Hale heard the left rear wheel of her wagon begin to knock. She pulled the horse down to a walk. Her mother leaned to listen. Eleanor Hale had been stronger before the fever she caught in October, but illness had not made her foolish. "That is not a pleasant sound." "No," Miriam said. "It is an expensive one." They were returning toward Las Vegas, after Miriam delivered a finished winter dress. The parcel money was tucked safely in her bag, and under ordinary circumstances, they would have been home before dark. But the wheel began to wobble. Miriam climbed down, gloved hands testing the hub, while the horse stood steaming in the cold. She did not like what she found. The road ahead was passable, but several more miles on a failing wheel. With her mother tiring beside her was not a sensible bargain. There was one ranch closer than town. By the time Caleb heard the knock, the light had gone blue beyond the windows. He opened the door and found a woman in a dark teal mantle, standing close beside an older woman whose face was pale with cold but fully alert. Snow clung to both their shoulders. Behind them, a horse stood beside a wagon at an angle that told Caleb something was wrong before the woman said a word. "My mother is tired, and the wheel will not carry us safely to town," she said. Her voice was steady. "We only need one night." Caleb looked once at Eleanor, then opened the door wider. "Bring her in." Caleb expected the matter to end with a repaired wheel and a safe road. For now, there was weather at the door and room by the fire. He added wood to the fire. Levi took the horse to inspect the wheel. Amos brought blankets and stew. Miriam settled Eleanor near the stove, then wiped the melted snow from the floor herself. "You can leave that," Caleb said. "I can," Miriam answered, "but then Amos will step in it." From the kitchen came Amos's voice. "I heard that." "Hmm?" Eleanor smiled. At supper, she ate well enough to ease Miriam's watchfulness. Looking around the plain room, she asked, "You don't keep Christmas?" Caleb set down his cup. "Not these last 2 years." His thumb pressed once against the handle. He waited for the next question. It did not come. Eleanor only nodded. "I see." Miriam did not ask why. She passed her mother the bread and asked Amos about the road west. Later, with Eleanor asleep, Miriam dried her gloves by the kitchen fire. Caleb heard the turn of a cup in her hands, the creak of the spare room bed, the small noises of people living in a house. He did nothing about it. By morning, the snow had eased. Levi had braced the wheel for a careful trip to Las Vegas. Miriam offered to pay for the repair. Caleb shook his head. Levi used scrap iron and bad language. Neither cost me anything. The bad language sounded expensive. Caleb almost smiled. Then Miriam helped Eleanor into the wagon, thanked the men without making gratitude into a debt, and left. The wagon rolled away. By noon, the house was exactly as it had been the day before. Eleanor's chair stood empty. A cup had been washed and set upside down to dry. The fire had settled back to its old, steady sound. Caleb stood in the room longer than he meant to. He had expected grief to belong to the large days. The funeral, birthdays, Christmas. Instead, it lived in smaller habits. Reaching for a second cup, turning to share a joke, coming in with a thought meant for someone no longer there. For nearly 2 years, Caleb had removed those moments one by one. Now he could see what little remained. 3 days later, he told Levi he was going into Las Vegas for the hardware order. Levi stared at him. Caleb put on his coat. "Something wrong with your face? I usually get the hardware." "I know. You don't trust me now? I trust you enough to do something else." Levi studied him for another second, then let the question go. "Then bring back coffee," he said. Caleb nodded. Las Vegas was busy despite the cold. Wagons moved along the winter-rutted street. Men stood under the awnings talking freight and cattle. A locomotive whistle sounded beyond the buildings, thin and sharp in the high air. Caleb handled the hardware first. He was halfway through a list at the mercantile when he heard a familiar voice at the dry goods counter. "I ordered 12 yards. The clerk said something apologetic. Miriam stood with 2 bolts of wool before her, one hand resting on the invoice. She saw Caleb at nearly the same moment he saw her. Mr. Mercer, Miss Hale. There was no surprise large enough to be called fate. Las Vegas was a town. People who did business there saw one another. Miriam turned back to the cloth. "This bolt is 8 yards, not 12. And the lining is not the weight I paid for." The clerk checked the paper. Miriam did not raise her voice or soften the correction for him. She knew what she had ordered. The clerk corrected it. Caleb watched her fold the invoice once before putting it away. Outside, she caught up to him on the boardwalk as a freight wagon rattled through the thin crust of snow. "My mother says I should thank you again." "You already did. She knows." She enjoys repeating herself when she thinks the repetition is useful. Caleb looked at her. Miriam's mouth shifted at one corner. He remembered the small turn at the corner of her mouth later that evening, while taking his gloves off by the stove. He could not have said why. He only knew he heard her dry little's answer again before he heard the wind outside. In January, Margaret Fiske invited Caleb to supper. She had invited him before. He had declined before. This time he went. He almost turned back twice on the walk from the stable to Mrs. Fiske's door. Inside, he chose the chair nearest the hall without thinking about why. The first time the whole table laughed at once, the sound hit him harder than he expected. His hand went to the back of his coat. For 1 second, leaving would have been easy. Then Eleanor Hale pointed her fork at a retired clerk and said the railroad had not improved Las Vegas, so much as taught it to make noise at greater speed. The table laughed again. Caleb stayed. The room smelled of coffee and damp wool drying near the stove. Miriam sat across from him, listening while Eleanor continued her argument as if winning it were a matter of public importance. At one point, Margaret asked whether Eleanor needed the chair nearest the stove. Eleanor said, "I need Mr. Pritchard to stop calling locomotive smoke progress." Miriam lowered her eyes to her plate. Caleb saw the smile she was trying not to show. He stayed through coffee. 2 weeks later, he saw Miriam again at the freight shed. This time, there was no accident in it. Their errands simply belonged to the same town. Miriam was waiting on a parcel of thread when Walter Keene pointed Caleb toward a split harness crate. "Brennan signed for it," Walter said. "I can put the shortage against his pay." Caleb's mouth tightened. He should have checked it. Then he crouched. The nail had bent outward. The slat had split from inside the crate, where Levi could not have seen it before signing. Caleb straightened. "No, take that back." Walter frowned. "Take what back?" "What I just said." He signed for a closed crate. "The loss has to go somewhere." The packing failed before Levi touched it. Miriam looked down at her parcel before Caleb turned. What stayed with her was not that he had been right the first time. He had not. He had looked again. That winter, small things changed at the Mercer ranch. Not all at once. Caleb ate one evening meal in the bunkhouse and stayed after the plates were cleared. He began leaving the sitting room door open. Once, when Levi started a story Caleb had heard twice, Caleb let him finish it anyway. No one commented on any of it. That suited Caleb. Not every step held. One night after supper with the men, he crossed the hall, saw the dining room door standing open, and shut it without going inside. The next morning, on his way out, he opened it again. One afternoon, he came back from Las Vegas before dark and found Levi and two younger hands repairing a broken gate brace near the south pasture. Caleb could have ridden onto the house. Instead, he dismounted, took off his coat, and held the timbers steady while they set the bolts. They worked until the light thinned. When Levi said Amos had coffee on, Caleb went with them. Nobody treated it as an occasion. That helped. The talk turned to a cow that had learned to push through a loose fence. Levi blamed whoever had built it 10 years earlier. "That was you," he said. "I was hoping nobody remembered. It was crooked. It stood 10 years, so has Amos." Caleb laughed. It surprised him less than it would have a month before. Later, alone in the main house, he noticed the sitting room lamp still burning when he went to bed. For nearly 2 years, he had put out every unnecessary light. His hand touched the doorframe. Then he left the lamp burning. There was oil enough, and he was tired of crossing a dark room when he did not have to. Then, on a cold Sunday in February, Amos stood in the kitchen with a stack of plates. "The men eating in here or over there?" Caleb knew what he meant. The kitchen table would hold 6 if men sat close. The dining room would hold everyone without effort. Caleb looked through the doorway. The long table was still under its cloth. For a moment he saw his mother at the far end, not as a ghost, but the way memory sometimes lays one ordinary picture over another. Her hands setting down bread, her voice telling someone to move because 2 more chairs were coming in. The old answer rose first: kitchen. It had protected him for almost 2 years. Amos shifted the plates. Caleb walked into the dining room, caught the edge of the cloth, and stood there with it in his hand. Then he pulled. "No," he said, "set this one." Amos did not smile. That was one reason Caleb trusted him. "Need another pot of beans, then." The men ate at the long table that afternoon. Boot heels shifted, spoons struck bowls, and Amos kept opening the kitchen door. Levi asked for bread with his mouth full. Someone complained about a gelding that could lift a latch. Caleb passed a plate and, nearly an hour later, reached for a second helping. Levi spilled coffee near Ruth Mercer's old chair and swore under his breath. Caleb looked at the dark spots spreading over the wood. Then he handed Levi the rag Amos tossed across the table. "Wipe it before he charges you for the table, too." Levi muttered something about unfair management, and Amos told him to use both hands. The meal went on. 3 days later, Clara Brennan came into Miriam's workroom with a torn sleeve and a complaint about her husband. Levy says Amos nearly charged him for spilling coffee on Mrs. Mercer's table. Miriam looked up. "The dining room table? The big one. They all ate there Sunday." Clara held out her sleeve. "Can you save this? Or must I tell Levi he has ruined 2 things in 1 week?" Miriam took the fabric between her fingers. "I can save the sleeve." Clara smiled. "I had greater faith in you than in him." They went back to the cuff. Only after Clara left did Miriam realize she had sewn the last 3 stitches more slowly than the first. One of those evenings came after a merchant's wife invited half a dozen people for coffee and cards. Miriam arrived late from work with a tiny tear near one cuff where a pin had caught the fabric. Margaret Fisk noticed it at once. "A dressmaker with a torn sleeve," Margaret said. "This may ruin your reputation." Miriam examined the tear. "I shall deny everything." Caleb laughed before he meant to. Miriam turned toward him. "You are now a witness, Mr. Mercer. I will expect discretion. I am known for it." "Good. I would hate to have to alter your memory." The conversation moved on, but Caleb found himself listening for her voice afterward. Not constantly. That would have frightened him if he had noticed it. But enough. Later, when Eleanor began describing an argument she had once had with a station agent, Miriam did not improve the story or shorten it or tell her mother. She had already told it. She listened as though she had not heard it before. When Eleanor forgot a name, Miriam waited. Eleanor found it herself. Caleb had seen people care for older relatives in ways that slowly turned the older person into a piece of furniture to be moved gently from place to place. Miriam did not do that. She could take her mother's arm on an icy step and, 5 minutes later, disagree with her over cards. A week later, Caleb remembered Miriam waiting while Eleanor searched for the forgotten name. Miriam, meanwhile, began to notice Caleb's quiet differently. He answered when he had something to say and let silence remain when he did not. Around him, it felt like room. By late February, finding Caleb and Miriam in the same room no longer required an explanation. At a merchant's supper, a man praised a dress Miriam had made for his wife. "Women know those things by instinct," he said. Miriam set down her fork. "Yes, the needles explain themselves after midnight." Caleb laughed into his coffee. The sound came out louder than he intended. Miriam looked across the table. "Something to add, Mr. Mercer?" Caleb wiped the corner of his mouth. "Only that I have never met an obedient needle." For half a second, Miriam looked as though she might refuse him the joke. Then one corner of her mouth moved. Later, the same man asked Caleb about winter grazing. Caleb gave an answer, and an older stockman quietly corrected one point about water near the North Range. Caleb stopped. "You're right," he said. "I was thinking of the lower pasture." Then he asked the older man what he had seen there. Miriam noticed that more than the cattle talk. He did not have to be the cleverest man at the table to remain himself. One evening over cards at Margaret Fisk's, she noticed something else. Eleanor had played 2 hands and was losing badly. Margaret, noticing her rub one wrist, fetched her shawl. "You must be tired, Mrs. Hale." Eleanor looked at the shawl, then at the cards. She folded the shawl once over the back of her chair. Then she cut the deck. "Deal." Miriam leaned back and said nothing. Caleb looked from Eleanor's hands on the cards to Miriam's face. Miriam was watching the game, not the shawl. A moment later, Eleanor won the hand and looked unbearably pleased with herself. By March, Caleb did a thing that surprised Amos more than the long table had. "Saturday," Caleb said. "We'll have people in." Amos stopped chopping onions. "How many people?" "Enough. That is not a number." Caleb named the Brennans, Margaret Fisk, 2 neighboring couples, a freight man and his wife, Eleanor Hale, Miriam Hale, and several of the ranch hands. Amos counted on his fingers. "That is too many. The table holds them." Amos looked toward the dining room. Then he went back to the onions. Caleb helped set extra chairs. He carried wood. He checked stable space for visiting horses. He set 2 chairs so close together, Amos stopped beside them. "Planning to seat children?" "There are no children coming." "Then give grown men room for elbows." Caleb moved the chairs. He did not ask how his mother had arranged such evenings. He did not search cupboards for the old decorations. Late that afternoon, before the first wagon arrived, he stood alone in the dining room. 14 chairs. For one hard minute, the old instinct returned. Empty the room before it had the chance to hurt. Amos appeared with a basket of bread. "Still want all these chairs?" Caleb looked at the table. Yes, Amos set down the bread. When Miriam arrived with Eleanor, she carried only her gloves and a small parcel Margaret had asked her to bring from town. Caleb took the parcel, then nearly asked what was in it before remembering it was none of his business. Miriam noticed the unfinished question. "Thread," she said. "I did not ask. No, you only looked like a man suffering from curiosity." Eleanor walked past them into the warm hall. "Both of you are blocking the door." They moved. The room filled before Caleb had time to think about it. Levi was arguing about horses. Clara had taken Eleanor into a conversation near the sideboard. Amos was moving between kitchen and dining room with the expression of a man who regretted every guest personally. Someone laughed at the far end of the table. Caleb stood with two stockmen near the window. The house was full. A burst of laughter rolled across the room. In January at Margaret Fisk's table, that sound had sent his hand toward his coat. Now Caleb only looked around. Levi was still arguing about horses. Clara had Eleanor laughing near the sideboard. Amos was threatening to stop serving coffee to anyone who left a cup on the floor. He did not reach for his coat. Then he looked for Miriam. She was not near the food or helping Amos. She was across the room with Clara, one hand around a cup, listening with that slight, intent tilt of her head he had come to know. When she laughed, Caleb heard it even with 3 conversations between them. There was an empty place beside her. Caleb excused himself from the stockman. He crossed the room. Miriam looked up before he reached her. The room kept talking around them. Chairs scraping, Amos calling for somebody to move a cup, Levi still wrong about horses. For half a second, neither of them said anything. Then Miriam shifted her chair and moved her cup. Made room. Caleb sat down. No one stopped talking. No one noticed. At least, no one polite enough to matter. Later, when the last wagon was being brought around, Miriam stood with Caleb near the entry while Eleanor buttoned her coat. "You had a full house tonight," Miriam said. Caleb looked back toward the dining room. "I did." She waited. He looked at her again. "I was glad you came." Miriam's expression softened. "Not much. So was I." Neither of them added anything. The next morning, Caleb still had cattle to see to, and Miriam still had work waiting in town. But after that supper, they stopped borrowing reasons to see each other. Caleb asked to walk with her after church. Miriam asked him to supper with Eleanor. Spring became summer. He learned she hated oversweetened coffee and could not pass a crooked picture without straightening it. She learned he checked a gate twice in high wind and never remembered where he put his gloves. By autumn, Caleb asked her to marry him on an ordinary evening with no storm, no audience, and no debt between them. Miriam said yes. They married late that year. And on Christmas Eve of 1889, Miriam worked later than she meant to in Las Vegas because a customer had discovered, at 4 in the afternoon, that a sleeve she had ignored for a month was suddenly an emergency. By the time Miriam turned the wagon toward the Mercer ranch, snow had begun to fall. Not heavily, just enough to soften the road and whiten the fence posts. Inside the ranch house, Amos was complaining about supper getting cold. Levi was already at the long table. Eleanor sat near the fire, arguing with Clara about cards. Caleb heard the wagon before anyone else did. He stood. Amos looked at him. "Sit down. She knows where the door is." Caleb was already reaching for it. He stepped onto the porch just as Miriam came up the path. She stopped when she saw the open door. "Were you waiting?" Caleb looked at the snow gathering on her shoulders. "Since before supper." Miriam smiled. A year earlier, she had stood at that same door asking for one night. Now Caleb had opened it before she could knock. Miriam stepped past him into the warm hall, brushing snow from one shoulder. From the dining room came Eleanor's voice telling Levi he had miscounted the cards, followed by Amos insisting supper was already ruined. Miriam looked toward the sound, then back at Caleb. Behind her, the porch boards were whitening again. Caleb closed the door. If you had been sitting at that long table, which moment would have told you Caleb had truly begun living again? The day he uncovered it, or the night he crossed a full room to sit beside Miriam? Tell me in the comments. And if you enjoy quiet frontier romances, where the biggest choices are not always the loudest ones, subscribe to Hidden Crown Tales. I'll meet you in the next story.